I'm most used to in the history of tinsmithing is all the origins in the U.S., which is all New England. The Connecticut, for those of you that don't know, is the foundation state, if you will, for the tinsmith art. Though Maine has the honor of having the first recognized tinsmith, though he was practicing in Massachusetts. So a lot of what are common stories about tinsmithing don't apply here. The peddler, the tinker, all of these people that are historical figures don't really manifest themselves out here. So how did tinware get here? That's one question that we can talk about. Hudson Bay played a pivotal role in that. And how did people get on the Puget Sound or in Old Oregon, the Oregon and Washington territories? So we'll talk about some of that. So next slide, please. So what am I trying to cover? First of all, why tin? Why would you use that versus something else? What do tinsmiths make? And what about tollware and turnware? Because those are other terms that people will hear about. And because the store and the grounds are set for 1855, I focused on 1855 in terms of what tinware is appropriate to use and what does it say about who you are, or does it say anything about who you are in the area. So what was traded, and we'll dig into the actual trade records, the sales blotter, and what does that say about what might have been available? And then, who were tinsmiths that made it into Oregon and Washington, and who made it onto the Puget Sound? When? All things I'm going to try and cover. So next slide, please. So tin is a simplification. It's really tin plate that we're working with. That's sheet iron up until the 1850s is the transition point, at which point it became sheet steel that was coated with a thin layer of tin. I have a friend in the steel industry, and he's constantly complaining about they're not tin cans. They're steel cans with a little bit of tin painted on them. And that's truly what tin plate is. It's got a very thin coating of tin. There are two types of tin that basically have to do with the origin of the ore. Block tin was a lower quality tin. It was often not refined as much. It was harder to refine as opposed to the grain tin, which came from a purer set of ore. So 90% of all the tinware that was made, though, whether it was block tin or grain tin, was bright tin. About 10% of it was painted tollware, which should be referred to as being japanned or Japanware. Why tin coating? Well, the oldest example of using tin on, actually I think it was cast iron, was for corrosion control. There was a key to a city in the very early Middle Ages that was tin plated to keep the key from rusting. Copper and brass vessels also corrode. If you are using either one of those for cooking, it should be lined. If you're going to cook anything, especially the acidic things. The corrosion, that lovely green patina on the copper roofs is poisonous. So anything that's either greenish or blue-green, or almost kind of an aqua color, are copper sulfates and sulfites that are poisonous. The other advantage to tin is it's very inert to the acids and bases in foods. So it makes an excellent surface to cook on, to store food in, or to eat food off of. So next slide, please. So why tinware versus something else? Well, according to Margaret Coffin, who in her book is one of the better known reference books on tinware, the history of tinware and toolware. All the first pieces of tinware were unpainted, and inexpensive kitchen items were very popular. But all of that comes from the fact that unpainted tinware used to be referred to as poor man's silver. And the other point that's made is that it's lightweight and it's easy to clean. So compared to hauling around cast iron or trying to clean wooden trenchers or those sorts of things, or clean cast iron, it's much simpler. It was much easier. Some alternatives to tin, and these are kind of like the most primitive, lowest cost effort, all the way up to the only what the very wealthy will have. You can cook in leather or birch bark. Baskets were lined with pitch. Sometimes they used heated stones to drop into it to heat it, but I've seen the experiment done even with a balloon. You can bring water to boil without breaking the vessel. It's when you try and push it too fast and go past the boiling point. Pottery, especially earthenware types of things, were less expensive, more readily available in some communities, but it's fragile. And then you run into all the different iron and pewter and those sorts of things that are all kind of somewhat common with tinware in terms of pricing. Cast iron was often more expensive and heavier, but not significantly enough so compared to some of the other categories. Sheet iron was often just used. The problem with that was it just rusted. And pewter, you had to be very careful of what quality of pewter you had, because pewter is a alloy of lead and tin, and some of the very inexpensive varieties had a much higher proportion of lead than is desirable. And modern pewter is made with no lead. It's basically tin with it's almost equivalent of Britannia metal, which has copper and antimony as minor ingredients. So the other thing that's important, especially from our perspective, is the historic view in that tinware was a very common part of the fur trade. It was very, very popular, though by no means the largest trade item. That goes to clothing and cloth. But it was very common. It was popular with the indigenous cultures, because if you are a culture that is used to traveling and moving camp on a regular basis, it's both lightweight, it's rugged, and it was, even in the fur trade, a relatively low-cost item, even though it came from England and was shipped all the way across the country. The next slide, please. So here I've tried to look at it in terms of what's a range of tinware that was made and who most likely would have owned it. And it runs the gamut from everybody to, okay, some of it's less likely to have been used other than by wealthy people in their fancy homes. So kitchenware, farmstead, storage, even lighting. Though lighting is where you start to see a little bit less likelihood that someone's going to own a lot of tinware. Just simply because if you are a laborer, your schedule is dawn to dusk. Candles are expensive, and so you don't necessarily burn a lot of them. So you may have a candlestick, but you don't need 5 of them. Now you get into things that apply in terms of a wealthy person's house: rain gutters, downspouts, cornices. Very elaborate cornice work was done. Weather vanes is something that a farmer might have. Speaking trumpets, hearing trumpets, those are things that if you are wondering where your next meal comes from, you're not really worried about whether or not I can hear as well. Wash basins, that probably fits better in one of the earlier categories in terms of how prevalent it is. And then you get to the decorative, the tollware, punch tin panels like in pie safes or tin ceilings, and even vases were made out of tin. These are all things that are going to be most likely used by someone in the upper part of the gentry. So I'm not going to read the left-hand side to you. You can use it. It's taken from a treatise of domestic economy published in 1845 by Catherine Beecher. And it's a list of tinware that the bride should have. So this is a listing of things that tinsmiths made that were considered important to have in a kitchen. There's another list of tinware similar to this one that's from what's called the House Book by Elizabeth Leslie, published in 1842. And that list is even more extensive than this one, and it's what you need in a good kitchen. On the right-hand side, there's a list of mid-19th century tinware from a tinsmith in New York that gives a little bit more variety in terms of the kinds of things that are used, including things that might be useful here. A coal hod, not necessarily for the use of coal, though the forge might find it useful, but certainly it's something that if you use charcoal or even kindling or that sort of thing, a bucket or a hod like that is a means to keep it. Chamber pails were certainly used by pretty much everybody that didn't want to go out, especially in the dead of winter in the middle of the night. Water pails. Dredging boxes are interesting. And then you get into pie tins, dish pans, pudding pans, scoops. These are all kind of commonplace. Yes?
What's a dredging box?
A dredger, to dredge something is if you're making fried chicken and you dip it into flour, it's a box that the flour is in, or whatever your dredging mixture is. So, tinsmiths made a wide variety of items, and these kinds of lists just kind of emphasize how many there are. And it's been this way from the very beginning. Thomas Passmore, who was a tinsmith in Philadelphia, actually advertised in the Federal Gazette, November 30th, 1793, and listed explicitly 78 different items that he made, and concluded with the statement, "Many other articles too numerous to mention." So, if you wanted it and it could be made out of tin, some tinsmith somewhere would make it for you. So, there are other items that tinsmiths made, though they often employ other people, especially for things like tollware. Tollware refers to a decorated tinware that has been basically painted. It was quite a bit more expensive. It was rare in that under 10% of all the tin ended up as tollware. Possibly it's just black. There is a common, I think, misunderstanding in some of the rendezvous community where anything that's been blackened is referred to as japanned. That's incorrect. To have been japanned, it would have been coated with a black paint that was referred to as asphaltium. And it's basically, asphaltium is a separate ingredient that goes into the concoction that they also call asphaltium. It's a tar. It's mixed with linseed oil and some other things. The interesting thing about the linseed oil is if you bake it, it will cross-link. So it is a polymer type of hardening agent. And that was the base. And it would be applied many, many times to get a thick enough layer. If you apply it very lightly, you can get some colors out of it. I've seen a very light purple. Most of the painted was most commonly referred to as japanned. So if you see a reference in any of the fort information, the historic fort documents that refers to something as japanned, it's referring to tollware. And there are two examples of it here. Black was the most common, but there, for the base, there were some others that were red and yellow are the other two more common base colors. And this was an attempt to recreate Japanese lacquerware. It first originated as an attempt to recreate that in England, and the towns of Pontypool and Usk are very well known for their tollware. Those two towns are also the source of much of the tin that was shipped to the U.S. and used by tinsmiths, as well as it was probably the manufacturing source for much of the tinware that Hudson Bay would have bought and shipped. So it is probably the largest category of things other than the bright tinware. There were a few things that were engraved is too strong a word. It's more like etched or scratched pictures into them. And then you get into Britannia metal, which is a pewter alloy made of tin, antimony, and copper. It's used primarily to be cast. And we'll see in a couple minutes that there was a lot of silverware. Tinsmiths used it to cast to make finials, so if you look at some of the teapots and coffee pots that I've made, and there's a little finial on the top, those are cast, and it would be used for that as well. Tinware contains both lead and tin in the coating on the outside. It was used for, generally speaking, less food-oriented things, though there were plates made of it, though generally a lower level of lead. But stovepipes, rain gutters, some cornices, and then roofing were made with tinware, and in the roofing case, it could be up to 100% lead, just no tin in the coating at all. So you will sometimes come across something that refers to like a black coffee pot. That is most likely not tin. It's more likely that it is sheet iron. If it isn't immediately rusting, it's probably coated in asphaltium. But sheet iron, generally speaking, is fairly black looking just as it comes. Just rusts more. So we're going to switch gears and talk about tinware that has been through the shop in here at Fort Nisqually. For the 1855 shop blotter, there were 101 entries for tin items. Now, I didn't make the effort to count everything. 101 is a very small fraction of everything that went through the store for the year. But having said that, there are only, 8, 9 items in total? And some of them, there weren't very many bowls. It was only listed once, and there were 4 of them. There was only one listing for oval dishes, and there were 2 of them. The big winners are kettles and pots. There were 61 pots. There were 53 kettles, plus the nest. So if you don't know what a nest is, it's a collection of the same item of generally different diameters, that are able to be shipped one inside the other. So the reference for buckles and stirrups were basically described as tinned iron. So it was a case where the tin coating was just to keep it from rusting. Pots. This one is fun because you will not find a cup listed anywhere in the blotter. There are lots of pots, 61 of them. They range from a half pint up to about a pint and a half in size. And pots is an old term for cup or mug. And I pulled that example out of the Groom and Company catalog appendix. It was published in 1880. It's an English catalog, and I think that's probably the origin of the term. But if you see pot, it does not mean anything like what we refer to as a pot. That was a pan.
What were pans?
Pardon me?
What were modern day pans called then? Just a general
It would
term
have been
for
a
whatever.
pan, yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
Though you have to be careful because things that they called pans didn't include what our narrower definition is. Milk pans is an example. It looks like a wash basin, and it was to collect milk.
Interesting.
Yes.
So, how did tinsmiths receive their raw material? Did they receive large sheets of tin?
No, the historic size of tin sheets is 10 inches by 14 inches.
Okay.
So if you look at the display I typically have, there's two coffee pots. One is, the base is a slightly smaller diameter than the other one. That one, I can get the body out of a single sheet of tin.
Okay.
The other one, the diameter is bigger than the 14 inches. So it has a little triangle piece that fills in at the bottom that's referred to as a gore.
Okay.
I make an even bigger coffee pot that has a much bigger gore that goes into it. Kettles, when they go above what you can do with a single sheet, which is about the smallest one, start getting multiple sheets fitted together.
Yeah.
And the largest ones are, at least it was common in colonial America to refer to them as, oh, that's a 2.5 sheet kettle, meaning that it took 2.5 sheets of tin to create the diameter.
And so would would a tinsmith receive a shipment of sheets or a delivery of sheets?
So yes, the smallest, I think the smallest shipment of common tin was 125 sheets, and that was in a box. You could also get them in hogsheads, and they're, depending on what ones you were getting, 225 sheets was a common one. There is a larger set of, there are larger sheets of tin that were somewhat available. And I have to be careful because most of my thinking about the history of tinware has been much earlier than this time period. And if I'm recalling correctly, the next size up was nominally 16 by 20, and it became more readily available about this time. But up until 1895, England was still providing almost all of the tin sheets that were used by American tinsmiths. Hudson Bay, for their purposes, shipped both sheets to sites like Fort Vancouver that had a tinsmith, as well as the finished product. And the finished goods were then transported either around the Horn to get here, or places awful close to here were supplied by the Land Express coming out of York on the Hudson Bay, and following the river and Great Lakes and everything, all the rest of the routes across the northern part of the U.S. and ending up at places as nearby as Spokane House. So it was only once Astor beat everybody else to the Columbia River and set up his trading post that you really saw ships coming around the Horn to supply the West Coast. We'll get into that a little bit more.
I have
So-
one more question about the pot. So if we're, out there at an event or something, we all kind of have our tin cups that we use for our water, should we be referring to them as our tin pots instead of our tin cups?
So you can. I don't think it's a requirement,
Yeah,
because I find a lot of historic catalogs in roughly this time frame, especially American ones, that just call them cups and mugs.
so it's just like. for
But
some
you
reason-
need to know that pots in this specific, in the case of going through the blotters,
Yeah,
and historically, if you come across that term, and there's a couple more that we'll hit here in a minute,
yeah,
you need to recognize that that's not what you think it is.
yeah, cool.
So Now let's talk about what the sizes of the pans and kettles are, because there was often a number associated with them. For kettles, there were 13.